So I want to talk about ISO, what it is, what it does, and how you can use it creatively as a cinematographer. To sum it up quickly, the ISO is going to be how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. The numbers that are used for your ISO are based on the numbers that the International Organization of Standardization created for rating the sensitivity of film stock. That is a real organization, I did not make that up, and that is also what ISO stands for. It sounds fake. When you talk about film stock and you hear things like 500T or 250D, those numbers are how sensitive those film stocks are to light. Now, digital cameras are different because unlike film stock with digital sensors, you're able to change the sensor's sensitivity to the light. This was originally called gain and it was measured in dBs, but at some point it switched to ISO numbers, which was great because now the sensitivity of the sensor correlates with the sensitivity of film. For instance, if you were somebody who shot a lot of film and you were used to shooting 500 rated film, you could just set your digital sensor to 500 and it would have the exact same exposure values of that film stock. And this is where the standardized numbers come in handy. Now, all of what I just said is not really going to matter a ton here, but that's just some fun history for you, just in case you ever wondered what those numbers meant. The basic fundamental thing that we all learn about ISO is that if you make the ISO higher, your camera will now be more sensitive to light and you'll introduce more noise into the image. If you make it lower, your camera will be less sensitive to light, but you'll have less noise in the image. This is technically true, but there is a lot more about ISO that I would like to get into. And we're also going to circle back around and talk about noise a little bit. But first, we need to talk about ISO and dynamic range because these two things are actually very much tied together. Every digital camera has a base ISO. The base ISO is essentially where the camera has the most usable, most balanced dynamic range while also having the lowest amount of noise. And that's not to say that there is no noise because there still is, but I'll explain. Let's take a look at the ARRI Alexa. The ARRI Alexa sensor is rated at about 14 and a half stops of dynamic range. At its base ISO of 800, we can see that the sensor has a pretty balanced distribution of almost around 8 stops of range in the highlights and just about 7 stops of range in the shadow. Now, what you'll notice here is that as the ISO changes, so does the dynamic range. As we move up in ISO, the range is shifting, giving us more information in our highlights, and as we move down, we're getting more information in our shadows. This is why you often see more noise at high ISOs. Most people will say increase their ISO if they're shooting a night scene because they want their camera to be more sensitive to light because night scenes tend to have a lot of darkness and shadow, but in doing so, you're actually taking away your camera's ability to see into those shadows, and that's where a lot of that noise tends to show up. It's completely counterproductive to what you think you're supposed to do because you'd actually be better off dropping your ISO down to 400 to 200 because you'd be able to look more into those shadows. That extra low-end range is going to help you get a cleaner image. Now, the thing about that you're probably thinking is, okay, well, if I'm shooting a night scene and I have to drop my ISO down to 400, does that mean I'm going to need more lighting? And the answer to that is yes. And that's the job of the cinematographer. Now, with all that said, the inverse is also true. Let's say you live out in California where it's often clear skies and it's very bright and sunny. You would be much safer increasing your ISO and then using NDs to bring your image down to exposure. This is because that increased range that you get in the highlights is going to help you a lot more with retaining that information in the sky. This is something that I see people starting out do where they'll go and they'll shoot an exterior and they will just lower the ISO down to where the image starts to look right. And in doing so, they will take away all of the camera's ability to hold any of the highlights in the sky. I know it's weird and it sounds like it's the opposite of what you'd think it should be, but the higher the ISO, it's going to be better for brighter environments, and the lower the ISO is usually going to be better for darker environments. And I know we're talking about the Alexa here, but this is true for pretty much any digital camera. Different cameras are going to have different dynamic ranges, and where those stops are distributed are going to be different. For instance, the FX3 at both of its base ISOs has about 6 stops of range in the highlights and 9 in the shadows, but those stops are going to move around with the ISO in the exact same way. This is also why Sony tends to be known for having better low light, because they have a lot of extra range in the shadows at higher ISOs. It's just the type of thing where you need to learn how your camera's sensor works so that you can get the best out of it. Now, I want to circle back to noise because I think we all tend to look at noise as this terrible thing that we need to avoid in our images, and it can be. There are very ugly noise patterns that you can get in your image if you go too far, but what if I told you a lot of Hollywood cinematographers are intentionally putting noise in their images? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about, using noise creatively. I think we live in a very post-clean image world. I think that grit and texture tends to be a quality that a lot of people look for in cinematography. Every movie and show, regardless of how it's been shot, seems to have film grain thrown on it. There are countless of film grain plugins that are available for sale. And I think that this is because we just love texture. We love texture and the life that it brings to an image. I think cameras have come such a long way today that noise isn't really that much of an issue unless you are really pushing your image. I'm talking like going 4 stops underexposed and bringing it all the way back up. That's when you're going to get that really nasty, really gross looking noise. Otherwise, I don't think we really need to be so actively avoiding noise because I think a lot of noise nowadays just kind of feels like film grain. Let's talk about Atlanta and Lady Bird. Atlanta had a unique process for how they filmed the show because they wanted to go for a grungy, gritty, unrefined, textured look. And to do so, they shot on ARRI Ramirez at 1600 ISO so they could raise up that noise floor. They underexposed the image by 2 stops, so whenever they would bring it back up to exposure, they introduced a bunch of noise into the image. I don't know if they did this same technique for the later seasons, but at least for season 1 of Atlanta, when you watch it, you're not looking at film grain, you're looking at camera noise. A similar thing is true for Lady Bird, but instead of underexposing on set, the crew filmed a gray card with the camera so that they could get a noise pattern, and then they just overlaid that over the footage. So when you're watching Lady Bird, you're not looking at film grain, you're looking at the camera's noise pattern. I know plenty of DPs who have shot projects at 3200 ISO and then would ND down to exposure just because they liked the pattern and the texture that it would introduce into the image. It gave it some life. I tested the Sony Venice one time, and my prep tech told me about a DP who knew that would always shoot that camera at 3200 ISO because he felt the noise just looked like film grain. And so I tried it out, and I thought it looked really convincing. I think most cameras actually have decent noise patterns. It's just when you push the cameras too much that that noise starts to become really ugly and unusable. It's just about figuring out what those limits are. I bring this up because I think we're all kind of taught to try to avoid having noise in our image. People always seem to talk like there's a specific way you should be shooting. You know, follow these camera settings to get the best image, but sometimes the best image isn't the right image. Every single option of every single setting in a camera can be used to create some sort of intentional impact. Experimenting with these settings and knowing what to select to achieve what you're going for is what separates cinematographers from videographers. Now you may be asking, you mentioned film grain plugins earlier, why would you want to add noise to your image instead of just shooting clean and then adding film grain on later? I don't know, you're the cinematographer, you tell me. Earlier I talked about shooting low ISOs for nighttime, but that's not to say that's what I think you should always do. That's so you can understand how your sensor reacts to light. If you want to go out and shoot a night scene at 3200 ISO and throw a bunch of noise in that image, I say go for it. I shot a film once, and due to a dumb mistake I made, we ended up having to get our last shot outside under a random street light. It was super dark outside. I just bumped my ISO all the way up to the max, and we just got the shot. There was a ton of noise in the image, it looked gross, it was harsh, but it ended up being a lot of people's favorite shot in the film because it felt real and raw and it connected to what the character was going through at that time in the film. It was one of those moments where you start to think differently about cinematography because here was this shot that was due to a mistake, it was objectively poorly shot, but it was the one that connected the most to people and that they remembered. I think if that shot would have been perfectly lit and shot super clean, it would have looked beautiful, but it just wouldn't have had the same effect. I'm like really running out of light here, so I'm gonna wrap this up. All this stuff about ISO, I guess what I want to say is that I think it's just another small thing that helps you create your art. Don't get bogged down with the rules on how you should and shouldn't use it because there are none. For me, I just think you should understand the full scope of what your ISO does to your image so you can leverage it in making your own art. Anyway, that's all I got. Bye.